Chartres Cathedral, also known as Cathedral of Our Lady of Chartres, is a medieval Catholic cathedral of the Latin Church located in Chartres, France, about 80 kilometers southwest of Paris. It is considered one of the finest examples of French Gothic architecture and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The current cathedral, mostly constructed between 1194 and 1250, is the last of at least 5 which have occupied the site since the town became a bishopric in the 4th century. The cathedral is in an exceptional state of preservation. The majority of the original stained glass windows survive intact, while the architecture has seen only minor changes since the early 13th century. The building's exterior is dominated by heavy flying buttresses which allowed the architects to increase the window size significantly, while the west end is dominated by 2 contrasting spires, a 105-meter plain pyramid completed around 1160 and a 113-meter early 16th century flamboyant spire on top of an older tower. Equally notable are the 3 great facades, each adorned with hundreds of sculpted figures illustrating key theological themes and narratives. Since at least the 12th century, the cathedral has been an important destination for travelers, and remains so to this day, attracting large numbers of Christian pilgrims, many of whom come to venerate its famous relic, the Sancta Camassa, said to be the tunic worn by the Virgin Mary at Christ's birth, as well as large numbers of secular tourists who come to admire the cathedral's architecture and historical merit. History, social and economic context. As with any medieval bishopric, Chartres Cathedral was the most important building in the town, the center of its economy, its most famous landmark and the focal point of many activities that in modern towns are provided for by specialized civic buildings. In the Middle Ages, the cathedral functioned as a kind of marketplace, with different commercial activities centered on the different portals. Particularly during the regular fairs, textiles were sold around the north transept, while meat, vegetable and fuel sellers congregated around the south porch. Money changers had their benches, or banks, near the west portals and also in the nave itself. Wine sellers plied their trade in the nave, although occasional 13th century ordinances survive which record their being temporarily banished to the crypt to minimize disturbances. Workers of various professions gathered in particular locations around the cathedral awaiting offers of work. Although the town of Chartres was under the judicial and tax authority of the Counts of Blois, the area immediately surrounding the cathedral, known as the Cloitre, was in effect a free trade zone governed by the church authorities, who were entitled to the taxes from all commercial activity taking place there, as well as greatly increasing the cathedral's income. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries this led to regular disputes, often violent, between the bishops, the chapter and the civic authorities, particularly when serfs belonging to the counts transferred their trade to the cathedral. In 1258, after a series of bloody riots instigated by the counts' officials, the chapter finally gained permission from the king to seal off the area of the cloitre and lock the gates each night. Pilgrimages and the legend of the Sancta Camassa. Even before the Gothic cathedral was built, Chartres was a place of pilgrimage, albeit on a much smaller scale. During the Merovingian and early Carolingian eras, the main focus of devotion for pilgrims was a well, known as the Puits des Saints Forts, or the Well of the Strong Saints, into which it was believed the bodies of various local early Christian martyrs had been tossed. The widespread belief that the cathedral was also the site of a pre-Christian druidical sect who worshipped a virgin who will give birth is purely a late medieval invention. In c. 876 the cathedral acquired the Sancta Camassa, believed to be the tunic worn by the Blessed Virgin Mary at the time of Christ's birth. According to legend, the relic was given to the cathedral by Charlemagne, who received it as a gift from Emperor Constantine VI during a crusade to Jerusalem. However, this legend was pure fiction, probably invented in the 11th century to authenticate some relics at the Abbey of St. Denis. In fact, the relic was a gift to the cathedral from Charles the Bold, and there is no evidence for its being an important object of pilgrimage prior to the 12th century. By the end of the 12th century, however, the church had become one of the most important popular pilgrimage destinations in Europe. There were 4 great fairs which coincided with the main feast days of the Virgin: the Presentation, the Annunciation, the Assumption and the Nativity. The fairs were held in the area administered by the cathedral and were attended by many of the pilgrims in town to see the cloak of the Virgin. Specific pilgrimages were also held in response to outbreaks of disease. When ergotism afflicted many victims, the crypt of the original church became a hospital to care for the sick. Today, Chartres continues to attract large numbers of pilgrims, many of whom come to walk slowly around the labyrinth, their heads bowed in prayer, an entirely modern devotional practice, but one which the cathedral authorities accommodate by removing the chairs from the nave once a month. Earlier buildings and the west facade. There have been at least 5 cathedrals on this site, each replacing an earlier building damaged by war or fire. Nothing survives of the earliest church, which was destroyed during an attack on the city by the Danes in 858. Of the Carolingian church that replaced it, all that remains is a semicircular chamber located directly below the center of the present apse. This chamber, known as the luminous crypt, is lower than the rest of the crypt and may have been the shrine of a local saint prior to the church's rededication to the Virgin. Another fire in 962 is mentioned in the annals, though nothing is known about the subsequent rebuilding. A more serious conflagration occurred in 1020, after which Bishop Fulbert began the construction of an entirely new building. Most of the present crypt, which is the largest in France, dates from that period. The rebuilding proceeded in phases over the next 100 years or so, culminating in 1145 in a display of public enthusiasm dubbed the Cult of the Carts, one of several such incidents recorded during the period. It was claimed that during this religious outburst, a crowd of more than 1,000 penitents dragged carts filled with building supplies and provisions including stones, wood, grain, etc., to the site. In 1134, another fire damaged the town, and perhaps part of the cathedral. The North Tower was started immediately afterwards, the South Tower some time later. From the beginning, it was intended that these towers flank a central porch of some sort in a narthex. When the North Tower rose to the level of the second story, the south was begun. The evidence lies in the profiles and in the mason's marks on the 2 levels of the 2 towers. Between them on the first level, a chapel was constructed to St. Michael. Traces of the vaults and the shafts which supported them are still visible in the western 2 bays. This chapel was probably vaulted, and those vaults saved the western glass. The stained glass in the 3 lancets over the portals date from some time between 1145 and 1155, while the south spire, some 103 meters high, was also completed by 1155 or later. Work was begun on the royal portal with the south lintel around 1136 and with all its sculpture installed up to 1141. Opinions are uncertain as the sizes and styles of the figures vary, and some elements, such as the lintel over the right-hand portal, have clearly been cut down to fit the available spaces. The sculpture was originally designed for these portals, but the layouts were changed by successive masters. See careful lithic analysis by John James. Either way, most of the carving follows the exceptionally high standard typical of this period and exercised a strong influence on the subsequent development of Gothic portal design. Some of the masters have been identified by John James, and drafts of these studies have been published on the website of the International Center of Medieval Art, New York. Construction of the present cathedral on 10 June 1194, another fire caused extensive damage to Fulbert's cathedral. The true extent of the damage is unknown, though the fact that the lead comers holding the west windows together to survive the conflagration intact suggests contemporary accounts of the terrible devastation may have been exaggerated. Either way, the opportunity was taken to begin a complete rebuilding of the choir and nave in the latest style. The undamaged western towers and facade were incorporated into the new works, as was the earlier crypt, effectively limiting the designers of the new building to the same general plan as its predecessor. In fact, the present building is only marginally longer than Fulbeit's cathedral. One of the unusual features of Chartres Cathedral is the speed with which it was built, a factor which helped contribute to the consistency of its design. Even though there were innumerable changes to the details, the plan remains remarkably consistent. The major change occurred 6 years after work began, when the 7 deep chapels around the choir opening off a single ambulatory were turned into shallow recesses opening off a double-aisled ambulatory. Australian architectural historian John James, who made a detailed study of the cathedral, has estimated that there were about 300 men working on the site at any one time, although it has to be acknowledged that current knowledge of working practices at this time is somewhat limited. Normally medieval churches were built from east to west so that the choir could be completed first and put into use while the crossing and nave were completed. Canon Delaporte argued that building work started at the crossing and proceeded outwards from there, but the evidence in the stonework itself is unequivocal, especially within the level of the triforium. The nave was at all times more advanced than ambulatory bays of the choir, and this has been confirmed by dendrochronology. The history of the cathedral has been plagued by more theories than any other, a singular problem for those attempting to discover the truth. For example, Louis Grodecki argued that the lateral doors of the transept portals were cut through the walls at a later date, and van der Meulen that they had wanted to rebuild the western portals. None of these theories refer back to the actual stonework, and it is only when one has done so, as John James did exhaustively in 1969, that one realizes that the construction process was in fact simple and logical. It is important to remember that the builders were not working on a clean site but would have had to clear back the rubble and surviving parts of the old church as they built the new. Nevertheless, work progressed rapidly. The south porch with most of its sculpture was installed by 1210, and by 1215 the north porch had been completed and the western rows installed. The nave high vaults were erected in the 1220s. The canons moved into their new stalls in 1221 under a temporary roof at the level of the clerestory, and the transept roses were erected over the subsequent 2 decades. The high vaults over the choir were not built until the last years of the 1250s, as was rediscovered in the first decade of the 21st century. Each arm of the transept was originally meant to support 2 towers, 2 more were to flank the choir, and there was to have been a central lantern over the crossing, 9 towers in all. Plans for a crossing tower were abandoned in 1221 and the crossing was vaulted over. Work on the remaining 6 towers continued at a slower pace for some decades, until it was decided to leave them without spires. The cathedral was consecrated on the 24th of October 1260 in the presence of King Louis IX of France, whose coat of arms was painted over the apsidal boss. Compared with other medieval churches, relatively few changes have been made to the cathedral since its consecration. In 1323 a substantial 2-story construction was added at the eastern end of the choir, with a chapel dedicated to St. Piat in the upper floor accessed by a staircase opening onto the ambulatory. The chamber below the chapel served the canons as their chapter house. Shortly after 1417, a small chapel was placed between the buttresses of the south nave for the Count of Vendôme. At the same time, the small organ that had been built in the nave aisle was moved up into the triforium where it remains, though sometime in the 16th century it was replaced with a larger one on a raised platform at the western end of the building. To this end, some of the interior shafts in the western bay were removed and plans made to rebuild the organ there. In the event this plan was abandoned, the glass in the western lancets was retained and the old organ was replaced with the present one. In 1506, lightning destroyed the north spire, which was rebuilt in the flamboyant style by local mason Jehan de Beecher. It is 113 meters high and took 7 years to construct. After its completion, Jehan continued working on the cathedral, and began the monumental screen around the choir stalls, which was not completed until the beginning of the 18th century. In 1757, a number of changes were made to the interior to increase the visibility of the Mass, in accordance with changing religious customs. The dubé that separated the liturgical choir from the nave was torn down and the present stalls built. At the same time, some of the stained glass in the clerestory was removed and replaced with grisaille windows, greatly increasing the illumination of the high altar. In 1836, the old lead-covered roof, with its complex structure of timber supports, was destroyed by fire. It was replaced with a copper-clad roof supported by a network of cast-iron ribs, known as the charpentier de fer. At the time, the framework over the crossing had the largest span of any iron-framed construction in Europe. French Revolution. The cathedral was damaged in the French Revolution when a mob began to destroy the sculpture on the north porch. This is one of the few occasions on which the anti-religious fervor was stopped by the townfolk. The Revolutionary Committee decided to destroy the cathedral via explosives, and asked a local architect to organize it. He saved the building by pointing out that the vast amount of rubble from the demolished building would so clog the streets it would take years to clear away. However, when metal was needed for the army, the brass plaque in the center of the labyrinth was removed and melted down. Our only record of what was on the plaque was Felabian's description. The Cathedral of Chartres was therefore neither destroyed nor looted during the French Revolution, and the numerous restorations have not diminished its reputation as a triumph of Gothic art. The cathedral has been fortunate in being spared the damage suffered by so many during the wars of religion and the Revolution. Though the lead roof was removed to make bullets and the Directorate threatened to destroy the building as its upkeep, without her roof, had become too onerous. World War II. All the glass from the cathedral was removed in 1939, just before the Germans invaded France, and it was cleaned after the war and releaded before replacing. While the city suffered heavy damage by bombing in the course of World War II, the cathedral was spared by an American Army officer who challenged the order to destroy it. Colonel Wellborn Barton Griffith, Jr., questioned the strategy of destroying the cathedral and volunteered to go behind enemy lines to find out whether the German army was occupying the cathedral and using it as an observation post. With a single enlisted soldier to assist, Griffith proceeded to the cathedral and confirmed that the Germans were not using it. After he returned from his reconnaissance, he reported that the cathedral was clear of enemy troops. The order to destroy the cathedral was withdrawn, and the Allies later liberated the area. Griffith was killed in action on 16 August 1944, in the town of Levis, near Chartres. Current history. In 2009, the Monuments Historiques division of the French Ministry of Culture began a $18.5 million program of works at the cathedral, described as a restoration project. Part of the project involved painting the interior masonry creamy white, with trompe-l'oeil marbling and gilded detailing. The restoration architect in charge of this painting is Frédéric Didier. The goal of the project, which is due for completion in 2017, is to make the cathedral look as it would have done when finished in the 13th century. The goal of the project and its results has been widely condemned. Architectural critic Alexander Gorlin described the goal as a great lie, writing that the idea that the 13th century interior of Chartres can be recreated is so totally absurd as to be laughable, and that it is against Every single cultural trend today that values the patina of age and the mark of time rather than the shiny bling of cheap jewelry and faux finishes. Alistair Palmer called the project an ill-conceived makeover. Architectural historian Martin Filler described the work as a scandalous desecration of a cultural holy place, an unfolding cultural disaster, and stated that it violates international conservation protocols. In particular the 1964 Charter of Venice, of which France is a signatory. Liturgy. The cathedral is still the seat of the Bishop of Chartres of the Diocese of Chartres, though in the ecclesiastical province of Tours. Every evening, since the 11th of September 2001, Vespers are sung by the Chemin Neuf community.